Okay, now we're going to begin sewing our binding to the front of the quilt. Remember, the pattern side we're calling the front and the solid side we're calling the back. The first thing I do is cut off these little dog ears where we made our binding because I just don't need extra things to take care of. And I cut off the little tails of my threads on the corner because I just want this to be easy, and doing things that make it easy make me happy. And there's one more little dog ear, and then we have a couple threads here that we can snip. So now we have a relatively clean edge to work with. Let me get that piece too. And again, I've got crazy colors in my binding. I've got crazy colors of my thread because I want to show you guys what's happening. So I've got blue in the top and red in the bottom. Now we were using a 1/4 inch stitch when we were stitching it to the back of the quilt. When we stitch to the front of the quilt, we want to move this stitching line over a little bit because the goal is to have the bobbin thread going right here in the ditch. We don't necessarily want it on the binding itself. We want that bobbin thread hiding right in here. And it is definitely not the easiest skill. It will take some practice, but once you figure out your stitch position on your own sewing machine, it's going to do it almost every time magically for you. So I'm going to go ahead and change my stitch position to be in a different spot than it was a minute ago. And let's see if I drop down and up, you saw that needle move hopefully a little bit. And now I'm just going to roll the binding right to the front of the quilt. And even though this is designed to be a 1/4 inch binding, you're always going to have a little more on the front than the back if you're doing the double machine binding, because you have to have something for your needle to bite into here that will still land on the quilt back here. If they were equivalent, then you would be fighting with this seam right here and running back and forth across it with your thread when you bind the front side of the quilt. So I move my needle over a little bit and I fold this over so you can see here's the stitching line, and you can see that I fold this just past that stitching line. And my goal is going to be to get my thread right on the edge of this because we don't want a big flange sticking out. We just want it to be nice and tight and neat. So let me see if I can zoom in for you. I'm going to move you right over here in front of the sewing machine, and let's get that corner out of the way. So we're going to start stitching, and then we'll move down to the corner, and I'll show you what I do for corners that helps that pretty miter happen on both sides of the quilt. So here we go, and I start with a little bit of a back stitch because you do want to make sure that that is sticking, and it doesn't look like it's sticking. I may have to re-thread here in a minute. No, it's going. Okay, so we're going to sew down to the corner, and then I'm going to try to flip it over to show you what happened on the back of this quilt. Lucky for you, I chose a very tiny quilt to work with. So you don't have to watch too long to see what's going to happen. When you come into one of these seams, you just roll right over it. And in just a minute, the corner is going to come into view, and I'll show you what I do to prepare for rounding the corner. Let's see if I can, sorry about that. Let's see if I can lift this up a little. Okay, so we've got the corner coming up, and the corners are a little nerve-wracking for people. So let me kind of see if I can tip that a little more, show you what I do when I get to the corners. So this is a case when I use pins. I use 2 pins per corner, and I do pull them out before I round the corner. So the first thing I'm going to do is take this the bottom piece that is parallel to the front of your sewing machine or your sewing area, get that thread out of there, and fold it up and decide exactly where I want that fold to be, where the next side of binding is going to be happening. And I stick a pin in that facing to the right so that the head of that pin doesn't get in my way later. And you can pin it just right up to that 1/4 inch stitch that you had made before. And then you're going to take the other side, pull it out. Think about like wrapping presents. You know how you wrap the presents at holiday season and you pull that out so you get a nice crisp corner? Pull that out and then fold that in so you have a pretty miter like that. and then you can pin that in place. So make sure that those 2 points match each other. I'll show you that again. You want this edge and this edge to match so that when you round the corner with the sewing machine, you can just turn and keep going. And you've got this nice miter that's going to go all the way out to the edge of the binding, and you're going to magically have the same miter on the other side. So I'm going to go ahead and start sewing down to the corner. When I get to the pivot point, that's when I'm going to pull out my two pins. So I'm going to hide those ugly threads under there, and we're going to start going to the corner. Okay, I'm going to move my hand so you can see what's happening. Right when I get to the pivot point, which will be in about 2 more stitches, 1 more stitch, I'm going to lift my presser foot, pull those 2 pins out because now the thread is holding that nice fold. Turn the corner, hand fold my binding again, drop that presser foot, and take off. And when I get to this next corner, I'll do the same thing so you can watch again. And then I will pull it out of the machine so you can see what we did. So let's see, we're almost there. And I do like to put these pins in when I have some wiggle room to work with. I don't wait until I'm way up here because you do need to get under it and handle it a little bit to get that fold pretty, because you do want to really pull on this to make sure that you're making a nice tight fold with your binding fabric. So there is one that I'm going to pin through, have that pin go right to this stitching line from the first round. I'm going to push this corner out, make sure I'm pulling it nice and tight from the back, fold that over, match this corner right here, and put another pin in so that it will hold for me. And then we'll do the same thing, tucking all those stray threads in. We'll go down to the corner. And then when we get to the first bite into the next side of binding, we'll pull both of those pins out, spin the corner, and we're ready to go again. So I'm going to finish off the last 2 sides, and then I'll pull this out and show you how it did. All right, I've rounded the last corner. I'm finishing up the binding. I do like to add a little back stitch here just to hold it all together, because this is probably the only stitch that isn't already covered by something else. So we have our binding. This is the front of the quilt. You can see that the binding stitch is pretty close. If I put up a ruler here, you'll see it is pretty close, within 1/8 of an inch of the edge, the folded edge of the binding. And if we flip this over, you'll see that that red bobbin thread is sitting right in the backing side of the ditch of the seam, where the first seam we sewed, whoopsie, now that happens every now and then. Sometimes you'll get a little bobble that'll go over the onto the binding, but this is kind of what you're striving for, where it's all going to hide just there in the ditch. And of course, if you were doing this on a real project, you would choose a thread that matches your backing, and then it's going to hide just as well as these quilting stitches hide, and you pretty much never see it. So there we go. That is double machine binding. And if you stick around through the end of the video, I will also show you how to hand stitch these miters closed, because there is a possibility for these things to come unfolded, especially on child quilts or baby quilts where they're just going to get a ton of use and little fingers digging in. So there is a way to do that as well, where you hand stitch those miters closed. And again, if you're entering high-level quilt shows, they're going to be expecting that to be done as well. Now, the next part of this video, I'm going to show you the same thing, except we're going to start by stitching the binding to the quilt front, and then we're going to hand stitch to the back. So I'll quickly show you stitching binding to the front of this quilt, and then I'll show you some hand stitching on the back, and then we'll do the miter corners, and then we'll be done. So stay tuned.